I drove 6 hours through rain, traffic, and silence just to be there for her. I didn't think twice. She had texted the night before, nervous about her big day, saying she just needed someone who understood, and I did. I always did. So, I packed a bag, filled the tank, and left before sunrise. I imagined surprising her with coffee in hand, maybe flowers too. I pictured that smile she used to give when we were younger, when showing up meant everything. But when I finally arrived, soaked from the walk and holding her favorite drink, she opened the door halfway, blinked at me and said, "You came. I told you I would." She looked past me, like checking if someone else was behind. Then she sighed, sharp and quiet. "Listen," she said, "I appreciate it, but some people don't understand boundaries." I stood there, arm frozen. Might offer, heart falling somewhere beneath my ribs. Boundaries. That's what she called it. Not miscommunication, not surprise, not confusion. Just a line I had apparently crossed by caring too much. I tried to smile to ask if she was okay, if I had misunderstood, but her eyes had already retreated. The door hadn't closed yet, but her presence had. And for the first time in all the years of showing up, of listening, of driving when no one else would, I felt like a stranger. Uninvited. Unwelcome. Like love had somehow become an intrusion, and all I could think was, how long had I been standing on her porch thinking it was home? I sat in my car for 23 minutes after she closed the door. I know because I watched the minutes tick by on the dashboard, each one louder than the last. The coffee I brought went cold in the cup holder. I didn't drink it, I didn't cry. I just sat there, stunned, my hands still on the wheel, like maybe I hadn't arrived yet, like this wasn't real. I kept replaying the moment in my head, trying to twist her words into something less sharp. Maybe she was tired, maybe she felt overwhelmed, maybe I should have called first. But in every version I played, the truth stayed the same. She looked me in the eyes and made me feel like a trespasser. And the worst part, I still wanted to stay. Still thought maybe she'd call me back out, apologize, explain. But the door never opened again. Not that day, not the next. I had driven 6 hours on a single sentence. I just need someone who understands. And somehow, I still misunderstood. Not the distance, not the need, but the space between us that had been quietly growing for years. Unspoken things, forgotten callbacks, moments where I showed up and she only half received it. Maybe this wasn't the first time I had arrived uninvited. Maybe it was just the first time she finally said it out loud, and it echoed louder than any silence she'd given me before, because rejection wrapped in boundaries feels cleaner, easier to justify. But it still bruises the same. And in that moment, I realized I had made a long journey to support her, but she had been walking away for far longer than I was willing to admit. I checked into a cheap roadside motel that night, one of those places with stiff sheets and humming lights where the silence feels heavier than the furniture. I didn't call anyone. I didn't tell her I was still in town. I just lay on the bed staring at the ceiling fan, spinning too slow to distract me. I thought about the years we had spent building something I thought was unbreakable. Sleepovers, shared secrets, middle-of-the-night calls. The time I drove to pick her up when her car broke down at 2 a.m., no questions asked. The way we laughed until our stomachs hurt and cried in parking lots without shame, but somewhere along the way, the laughter got quieter and the calls less frequent. I just didn't notice how far we'd drifted until I arrived and found the door only opened halfway. Maybe I kept showing up out of habit or hope or fear that if I didn't, no one would. But now I was here, in a strange bed, in a strange town, wondering how I became the one that didn't understand boundaries. She always said I was the steady one. And maybe I held on too tightly to what that meant. Maybe I believed that love meant always being available, even when no one asked. But now, I wasn't sure, because I had arrived full of intention, arms open, heart willing. And she had met me with distance disguised as protection. I pulled the covers up, not because I was cold, but because I needed something to hold. And, for the first time in years, I didn't know whether I was comforting myself or mourning a friendship that might have ended long before I ever got in the car. The next morning, I woke up before the sun. The motel room bathed in that strange gray-blue light that makes everything feel colder. I stared at the ceiling again, but this time I let the stillness press in. I didn't rush to leave. I didn't pack. I just sat there with the truth I had tried so hard not to name. I had been chasing a version of us that no longer existed. Maybe it had died quietly. Maybe it had shape-shifted into something unrecognizable. But either way, I was the only one still pretending we were the same. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through old messages. There they were, my long paragraphs, her short replies, my thinking of you voice notes, her busy, we'll call later texts that rarely came. It wasn't just yesterday's rejection, it was years of shrinking exchanges, of me reaching, of her pulling away, gently enough that it didn't seem cruel, just tired, just distracted, just busy. But over time, even soft distance becomes a wall. I had told myself she was overwhelmed, that I needed to be patient. That being the dependable one meant I didn't get to have needs. But what I hadn't asked, what I had been too afraid to ask, was whether I was still part of her life or just a relic of who she used to be. And now, sitting in that room with coffee from the lobby and the sound of cars passing on the highway, I finally admitted it to myself. She didn't forget me. She had outgrown me, and I had refused to see it. Not because I lacked boundaries, but because I kept hoping she'd remember who we were without me having to remind her. I decided not to text her, not to explain why I had come, not to defend my heart as if showing up was something I should be ashamed of. Instead, I went for a walk. The town was still waking up, windows opening slowly, people sweeping storefronts, streetlights flickering off one by one. I walked without direction, just moving because stillness had started to feel like drowning. Every few blocks I passed someone who reminded me of us. Two girls laughing at nothing, arms linked, believing the world was big, but we were bigger together. I used to think that kind of bond was unbreakable, but I'm learning now, even the strongest threads can fray if they're always pulled from one side, and I had pulled for too long. Held tight, called first, apologized more, made excuses for silences I didn't create. I used to believe that loyalty meant staying until the other person realized your worth. But what if loyalty, real loyalty, means knowing when to stop knocking on a door that only opens out of obligation? What if love sometimes means letting go before resentment takes its place? I passed a bookstore. The window display was titled Beginnings. I smiled at the irony because this didn't feel like a beginning. It felt like a slow, quiet ending that had started years ago. But maybe that's how some chapters close, not with slamming doors, but with someone no longer showing up where they're no longer seen. I paused at the corner before turning back. Not toward her house, not toward another conversation that would leave me emptier, but toward myself, toward a morning that no longer needed her presence to matter. I decided not to text her, not to explain why I had come, not to defend my heart as if showing up was something I should be ashamed of. Instead, I went for a walk. The town was still waking up, windows opening slowly, people sweeping storefronts, streetlights flickering off one by one. I walked without direction, just moving because stillness had started to feel like drowning. Every few blocks I passed someone who reminded me of us. Two girls laughing at nothing, arms linked, believing the world was big, but we were bigger together. I used to think that kind of bond was unbreakable, but I'm learning now, even the strongest threads can fray if they're always pulled from one side, and I had pulled for too long. Held tight, called first, apologized more, made excuses for silences I didn't create. I used to believe that loyalty meant staying until the other person realized your worth. But what if loyalty, real loyalty, means knowing when to stop knocking on a door that only opens out of obligation? What if love sometimes means letting go before resentment takes its place? I passed a bookstore. The window display was titled Beginnings. I smiled at the irony because this didn't feel like a beginning. It felt like a slow, quiet ending that had started years ago. But maybe that's how some chapters close, not with slamming doors, but with someone no longer showing up where they're no longer seen. I paused at the corner before turning back. Not toward her house, not toward another conversation that would leave me emptier, but toward myself, toward a morning that no longer needed her presence to matter. Back at the motel, I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at my suitcase. I hadn't even unpacked. My clothes still folded, toothbrush untouched, like I had never planned to stay. And maybe, deep down, I hadn't. Maybe I had come hoping the gesture would fix something that was already gone, that showing up would rewind time. But love doesn't work like that. Neither does friendship. Not when only one person is doing the remembering. I pulled out my phone again, opened our last conversation. I read the message she had sent. It just feels like too much sometimes. I need space, I hadn't answered, and now I finally understood why. Because when someone asks for space, you can give it from love or from fear. I had always given from fear. Fear that distance would turn into disappearance. Fear that if I stepped back, she'd never step forward. But now, I saw the truth. I had never been in the room. Not really. I had been standing at the edge hoping proximity would become presence. And when she finally spoke the word boundaries, I heard it not as a wall, but as a mirror. I wasn't being asked to stay away because I was too much. I was being shown the space she had already placed between us. And now, for the first time, I was choosing to respect it. Not as rejection, but as a redirection. I zipped the suitcase, stood quietly, and looked out the small motel window at the empty road ahead. Leaving didn't feel like giving up. It felt like giving myself back the room I had spent too long waiting to be invited into. I stopped halfway home at a lake I hadn't planned to visit. It was a place we used to go years ago, before everything became complicated. Back then we'd sit on the rocks, throw pebbles into the water, talk about boys, dreams, and the kind of future we thought we'd face side by side. I parked the car, stepped out, and let the wind tingle through my hair. It felt good to be somewhere quiet, where nothing was expected of me. No apologies, no explanations. Just the sound of water and the rhythm of my own breath. I sat at the shoreline with my shoes off, letting my toes touch the cold edge. The sky was soft with early afternoon clouds, and for a moment I imagined I was 15 again before life split us into separate maps. We had been so close once, but closeness without presence is like a song you remember the melody of but can't sing anymore. I thought of texting her again, telling her I understood, telling her it was okay, but I didn't, because for the first time it really was. I didn't need her to rewrite the moment. I didn't need her to take it back. What I needed was already happening. This silence, this stillness, this space where I could sit with myself and feel whole again. She wasn't here, but I was, and that mattered. I took a photo of the lake not to send, but to keep, not as a memory of us, but as a marker of me, the woman who drove 6 hours expecting to be welcomed and left learning how to welcome herself. I found a diner near the lake, the kind with scratched menus and servers who call you hun. I ordered pancakes at 2 in the afternoon just because I could. No one asked where I was coming from. No one expected me to be anything other than hungry. It felt strangely healing to be anonymous and still seen. I ate slowly, letting the syrup pool, letting the moment hold me without asking for a story. There was a woman across the room, older, alone, reading a paperback. She looked peaceful, not lonely. I wondered if she had once been the one who drove too far for someone who didn't ask her to. Or if she had simply learned earlier than me that loving others doesn't mean emptying yourself for the ungrateful. As I paid the bill, the waitress smiled. "You heading home?" And I realized I didn't know how to answer that, because home used to be the people I'd show up for. But now, it felt more like the version of me I kept abandoning. And maybe, for once, I was on my way back to her, driving without chasing, eating without shame, breathing without asking for permission. Back in the car, I didn't turn the music on. I let the quiet speak. And in that space, I heard something unexpected. My own permission to stop begging for inclusion. To stop proving I was enough by arriving first, staying longest, loving hardest. That's not love. That's survival, disguised as devotion. And I was done surviving for people who only called it too much. I drove on, not faster, not slower, but steady. Like someone who knew now she wasn't lost. She had just taken the long way back to herself. By the time I reached the city, the sky was folding into dusk soft purples and golds, stretching across the skyline like a quiet apology from the universe. I parked in front of my apartment, not rushing to unpack, not checking my phone. For once there were no drafts of messages I was rehearsing. No imagined conversations where I'd finally explain how much I gave, how deeply it hurt. Because I didn't need to be understood by her anymore. I needed to be understood by me, and I walked into my apartment, and it felt different. Not because anything had changed, but because I had the silence. No longer echoed as lack. It rested like calm, like space I didn't have. To shrink in, I made tea, sat on the couch, lit a candle I'd been saving for some imagined special moment. This was it. Not because the moment was extraordinary, but because it was mine. Fully, freely. I pulled out my journal, wrote at the top of the page. You don't have to explain why you showed up. You only need to know why you stopped. And beneath that, I listed the ways I had always arrived for her, for others, for love. But the list didn't end with what I'd done. It ended with what I was reclaiming. My time, my voice, my peace. Not to be used, but to be honored. Because I hadn't been too much. I had just been too generous in rooms that only knew how to take. And now, I was learning to offer that generosity inward. Not out of fear, not for reward. But because I finally believed I was worthy of my own arrival. A week later, she texted just 2 words. "You okay?" No apology, no mention of what happened. Just a breadcrumb tossed into the silence like that alone could stitch the tear. I stared at the message for a long time, thumb hovering heart. Steady, the old me, would have answered instantly. Would have softened the edges, made excuses, let the hurt hide behind casualness. But I wasn't that version anymore. Not after the drive. Not after the motel silence. Not after finding peace in pancakes and lake water. So I replied simply, "I am now." She didn't respond, and I didn't chase it. Because that message wasn't a test-it, was a declaration. A line drawn with calm hands. I was okay. Not because she asked, but because I had stopped asking for her to see me. For so long, I thought closeness meant endurance. That love looked like weathering the storm no matter who created it. But now, I was learning. Love without respect is just erosion, and I had eroded enough. She could come back if she wanted. Or not. But I wouldn't shrink again to make room. For someone who thought my loyalty was invasive, I was building a home within myself, one where my presence was not a burden but a blessing. And the people who stayed wouldn't just tolerate that, they'd welcome it. So when her silence stayed silent, I didn't ache. I didn't wait. I closed the conversation, made tea, and opened the book I had been meaning to finish for months. And I read without guilt. Because I wasn't just healing, I was honoring the woman who drove 6 hours to love someone and finally remembered how to love herself back. The days that followed were quieter than I expected, but not in a lonely way. It was the kind of quiet that follows a storm, when the air smells clean and the world feels honest again. I found myself laughing at small things: spilled tea, a crooked painting, the way my cat blinked like I was interrupting her peace. I hadn't realized how long I'd been living in reaction to others. Always adjusting. Always measuring my steps to match someone else's comfort. Now, I moved at my own pace. I called friends who always picked up. I sat in parks and read entire chapters without looking at my phone. I cooked meals just for me. Lit candles without occasion. Not because I was trying to distract myself, but because it felt good. Wholly mine. And that's when I understood I had mistaken her withdrawal as my deficiency, but maybe her distance had nothing to do with my depth, only with her own limits. That's the thing about people who can't receive you fully. They'll call your sincerity too much only because they've only ever known love in fragments. And I had offered them the whole page. I wasn't ashamed of that anymore. I had spent too many years apologizing for being the one who showed up, the one who cared first, the one who remembered. But now, I was learning how to remember myself. And it didn't require an audience, just intention, just tenderness, just choosing not to vanish when someone else finds me inconvenient. So I folded a small note into my journal that night. It read, "You're not too much. They just weren't enough to hold you." And I believed it without needing anyone else to say it back. That weekend, I cleaned my apartment not out of necessity, but as a kind of ceremony. I opened the windows wide, let the breeze move through the rooms like forgiveness. I dusted off corners I had ignored, watered plants that had wilted from my inattention. I was learning that healing isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's scrubbing the kitchen floor while humming to yourself. Sometimes it's putting on lipstick. Even if no one's coming over, I rearranged the photos on my shelf, removed the ones that made me ache, kept the ones that made me feel seen. And in that act, I wasn't erasing anyone, I was making room for the version of myself that no longer had to cling to what was. Later, I took a walk with no destination. The sun was setting, painting soft amber light over the sidewalk. I passed a group of women laughing on a patio, and for a second, I imagined my younger self among them, hopeful, eager, always the one reaching. I smiled at her, not in pity, in gratitude, because she taught me how to love deeply, and now I was teaching her how to love wisely. I sat on a bench near a fountain, journal in my bag, phone on silent, and for the first time in what felt like years, I didn't feel like I was missing something. I wasn't waiting for the next message, the next apology, the next chance to prove I was worth keeping. I already was. Even in silence. Especially in silence. And the road I once drove for someone else, I now walked for myself. No GPS, no destination. Just the quiet knowledge that I had finally come home to the one person who never left me. Me. A few weeks later, I got another message, this time longer. "I'm sorry if I hurt you, I just needed space. Things have been heavy." I read it twice. Then again, it wasn't cruel. It wasn't cold, but it also wasn't what I once would have clung to. There was no invitation to talk. No acknowledgement of the miles I drove, the silence I sat with, the cost of being called too much for showing up. And yet, for the first time, I didn't need those things, because I wasn't waiting for validation anymore. Not because I didn't care, but because I finally cared more about me. I replied simply, "I understand. Take care." Then I turned my phone face down, poured myself tea, and opened a book. I didn't reread the message later. I didn't overthink the tone. I didn't measure what wasn't said. Because the door she closed weeks ago, I had already walked away from it. Not in anger, not in bitterness, but in peace. I was no longer trying to earn my place in someone else's life. I had earned something better, my own presence. And there's a quiet power in that, in no longer fighting to stay where you're not fully welcomed, in knowing that love is not measured by miles traveled, but by how gently someone holds your arrival. I drove 6 hours thinking I'd be received, but I came back with something far more valuable, the understanding that I deserved to be met, not managed, not tolerated, met. Fully, and if someone can't do that, it's no longer my job to shrink, but their loss to carry. The next Sunday, I lit a candle and made breakfast for one. Not out of sadness, but as a quiet celebration, I put on soft music, cracked the window open, let the wind dance through the curtains. There was a joy in that stillness. I never used to recognize a peace that didn't depend on anyone showing up. I realized I'd spent so many years arriving for others, hoping that one day they'd turn around and notice the woman who never missed a moment. But I had stopped showing up for myself in the process. Not anymore. Now, I was learning to celebrate the mornings that didn't begin with someone else's name, to fill the silence with laughter that didn't wait for permission, to be enough without a +1, a reply, or a place at someone else's table. I went for a walk that afternoon through a part of town I never explored before. Not because I had to go there, just because I could. And somewhere between the bookstore and the bakery, I caught my reflection in a shop window. She looked different, not hardened, not guarded, just rooted. Like a woman who had finally stopped proving she belonged and simply decided she did. No questions asked. No applause needed. And it struck me, maybe the reason it hurt so much before was because I kept thinking my love was a burden to be negotiated, instead of a gift to be received. But now, I know. Love isn't too much. Showing up isn't crossing a line. It's sacred. And the people who can't hold that, they don't need correcting. They just need to be released, so we can make space for those who never flinch when we knock. That evening, I sat down to write, not to her, not about her, but for me. The journal pages were soft and familiar, like hands that had waited patiently to hold my truth. I didn't write about the drive. I didn't recount every word she said. I wrote about the moment I turned the key in my door and felt peace. About the lake, the pancakes, the candlelight in an empty room that somehow felt full. I wrote, I was never asking for too much. I was just asking the wrong person. And with that line, something settled. I no longer needed to circle back. No more justifications, no more bargaining with memory. I had arrived fully in the life I kept trying to be invited into, and it was mine now, unshared, unexplained, undeniable. I closed the journal, placed it gently beside my bed, and turned off the light. The room exhaled with me. I had spent years mistaking silence for peace, rejection for protection, and absence for strength. But now I knew real peace is what happens when you stop knocking, start walking, and realize you already belonged to yourself. I drove 6 hours to support her. She said, some people don't understand boundaries. Maybe she was right, because I used to think love meant showing up no matter what. But now, I know love also means knowing when to go home, especially when home is no longer a place, but a decision to stop waiting at doors that only ever open halfway. And you? Have you ever crossed oceans for someone, only to realize you were the only one swimming? If this story spoke to something you've lived, just comment. I'm not waiting outside anymore.